Okay, we'll make a start. So welcome back after lunch. And we're up to session 5, which in your booklets commences on page 32. So in this session we're talking about what happened with the people of Judah when they were exported to Babylon. What did they get up to there? And eventually, in God's fullness of time, they were granted reprieve to go back to their homeland and establish themselves back in Jerusalem. So that's what we're about in session 5. On the screen you'll find the kings and the prophets that were current at that time. So if you notice on the top slide, the line of the kings of Israel, that they finished with the last king Hoshea in around about 700, compared to the kingdom of Judah, which lasted a lot longer. And we wonder why, but we know the answer, because Simon had told us that the kings of Judah, there were some good and some bad. The kings of Israel, they were all wicked, and therefore the punishment for the kingdom of Judah was delayed somewhat, but it was precipitated by these kings here, and I would call it 3JZ. 3JZ? Yeah, 3 J's. There was Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, there's the 3 J's, and the last king, Zedekiah. So, very quick recap on what Simon was talking about. Nebuchadnezzar sieges Jerusalem. Let's just go back a step, because with these 3 kings here, they were basically puppet kings that King Nebuchadnezzar had put in place to do his bidding. He came and invaded, but he didn't make a complete destruction of Jerusalem to start with. His first invasion, he invaded 3 times. His first invasion, he took away the cream of the people. And amongst that cream was Daniel. And so Daniel, with his 3 friends, were exported to Babylon. And so these kings that Nebuchadnezzar set up to do his bidding, the last king Zedekiah rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar's rule, and so Nebuchadnezzar, fed up, came in, invaded the city, and so besieged it. Famine ripped through the land, and the city was in severe trouble. And the book of Lamentations, after the book of Jeremiah, talks about the bad conditions that beset the city. Jeremiah chapter 39 verse 1, in the 10th month, in the 9th year of King Zedekiah, Nebuchadnezzar came with his full army and full force. And as Simon has said, Jerusalem was destroyed, the city was burnt, the house of the Lord was destroyed, all the houses of Jerusalem were turned to rubble, and all the walls of Jerusalem were broken down. Jeremiah chapter 39 verse 1 and 2 tells us about what happened. It was the 9th year of Zedekiah, and very, very specific about the time. The 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar came and besieged it. The 11th year of Zedekiah, 4th month, the city was broken up. And some terrible things happened. So the last king, King Zedekiah, of whom Ezekiel 21 talks about, "I remove the diadem, take off the crown, will be no more until whose right it is," which was Jesus. His kingdom was taken away, his sons were slain before him, and then his eyes were put out. So the last thing that he remembered to be seen was the death of his sons, and then he was taken in chains and carried off to Babylon. And so there was a great mass deportation of all the people. 2 Chronicles 36 verse 16 says the reason why God's fury rose up against his people. They mocked the messengers of God, they despised his words and misused his prophets until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people till there was no remedy. And so the remedy was teach them a great and long-lasting lesson. Take them into a strange land and let them really rely upon my mercy until I'm ready to bring them back to their own land again. There's a lot of archaeological carvings and reliefs that depict this time. Not only how terrible the Babylonians were in taking people away captive, but also the things that happened day to day. This is an archaeological relief of a stone carving in the palace of Tiglath-Pileser of Babylon, showing the deportation of the citizens of Judah who lived in the city Ashtaroth. So, just a quick overview and a quick look. This is where they were deported, from Jerusalem right down about 1,500 kilometres to Babylon. Here are some of the significant people who figure at this time. Of course, there's Daniel, of whom we're going to talk about in a moment. There's Jehoiachin, there's Ezekiel the prophet, who was a prophet in Babylon, recording the time and encouraging the people to turn to God and saying what would happen. Not too far away, there was Esther and Mordecai. And Nehemiah and Ezra were also figuring in this area. And you can see that Jeremiah ended up at Egypt. We'd like to turn your attention to Daniel. And if you're able to turn to the book of Daniel, which is towards the end of the Old Testament, one of the minor prophets, but not minor in significance, because Daniel has a lot to say about this time, particularly locked away in this strange land as an exile in Babylon. And we'd like to talk about his place in God's plan. So, the people in captivity are basically taken down to this line here. They were taken down to what they probably thought was a region of sin and death. They were taken to a godless, idolatry-serving nation, the Babylonians, where Nebuchadnezzar ruled supreme and his word was law. Did you know that ending up in this strange land was a prophecy that Jeremiah gave right back in Jeremiah chapter 24? The whole land shall become a desolation and an astonishment. But the remarkable thing about the Bible is it's super accurate, because saying this so long before this happened even gave a determining time for how long the people would be in this export land. 70 years they would serve the king of Babylon. And makes it very clear, Jeremiah does, that after that time that they would be released and allowed to go back to their homeland. It's very, very specific. This was a prophecy that was given before this event actually occurred. And so that's one of the reasons why we can rely upon the veracity of the Bible to be confident that this blue line will lead us to Christ and his words will lead us to the kingdom. A little prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 25 verse 11. Before we get to the dream, let's talk a little bit about Daniel. If you're in the book of Daniel and you're in chapter 1, we read about the time when Daniel and his three friends were the first conscientious objectors. Because they were asked, in their preparation to serve the king, to go through some rituals of food and drink eating particular things, drinking particular things, and they realised that these food and the wine were offered to idols, they made a conscientious objection or stand and said, no, we won't do that. We'd rather have the vegetables and water, and God can guarantee that we will look as healthy or healthier than the others who have been fed up on the king's meat. They took a stand for what they believed was right. And we see this all the way through the book of Daniel, that Daniel trusts in a strange land wholeheartedly on his God to get him through the tough situations. It's 1,500 kilometres away. He was a young man. He was probably just out of his teens. But yet he had this confidence and this strong belief in a Messiah, in the blue line, and in God's promises that would be fulfilled in the future. That he was in a land which was the promised land that he'd been ripped out of, and he was now dwelling in a strange land with strange people, with strange customs. Yet he wasn't going to assimilate into the way that they believed, thought, and taught. This served him in good stead. He was a regular, God-fearing man and prayed regularly. The king knew this, and therefore one day when the king Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, Daniel was called to interpret the dream. The dream that we're about to put before you, if you're first-time readers of this particular account in the Bible, is actually a blueprint for the world history. And it's probably one of the best examples that we can provide as to the reliability, the authenticity, and the incredible accuracy of the Bible. Because well ahead before its time, it plots out the nations which would arise, the nations which would topple, and eventually, right through into the present day, it gives an accurate account of world history. But at the moment, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, was the dominant world power. Yeah, sure, Egypt had been in the fray. Egypt and Babylon were tussling over the region of Israel, and Babylon came out on top. So Babylon was the one who was in control of this whole region. And as you can see, this territory over here took in Babylon, took in all this area here, up Syria and around to Israel. That's what King Nebuchadnezzar controlled. You may also remember in the book of Daniel that there are a number of accounts of really incredible things that happened. And I'm sure that you're familiar with some of these from maybe Sunday school stories about Daniel's three friends. Again, stood up for what they believed, and for their beliefs were placed in a huge big fiery furnace. But God was there with his angel to protect them. They didn't bow down to the image, and Daniel eventually, towards the end of his life, was placed in a den of lions, but was saved because of his belief in God that he would save. Because Daniel wasn't a person to dwell on the red line. He was a person to believe in a promised seed and a kingdom to come. This is where Daniel was. This is where Nebuchadnezzar and his countrymen were. They were on the line to sin and death. But the king had a dream. And the dream troubled him so much that he made this unusual request to his court magicians and astrologers. He summoned them one day and said to them, I have had this dream and I want you to make the interpretation. I don't know what it meant. Now that's one thing. But to actually say, and I can't even give you what the dream was, you need to tell me the dream and tell me what it meant. Well, that was probably too much that most people could even handle. Because Daniel chapter 2, verses 2 to 3, these are the people that he called. The wise men, were basically psychics. The magicians, people who could cast spells, or the witches of the land. Astrologers, fortune tellers, sorcerers, people who claim to communicate with dead ones, and the Chaldeans, people who were all into numerology and psychic divination. All these airy-fairy arts, they couldn't even work out what the dream was, let alone work out what the meaning was. So, on the pain of death, tell me or you'll die, Daniel was summoned. He was able to not only understand what the dream was, but he was able to, with God's help, reveal what the dream meant. Daniel chapter 2, verses 16 to 23. We won't read the whole lot, we'll just pick out a couple of things. Verse 16. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time that he might tell the king the interpretation. And then he goes and seeks God's help. He prays to God. And verse 19, then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And so he presents himself before the king and gives King Nebuchadnezzar the understanding of what his dream was. And he basically then gives him the interpretation. And this was it. He says, "Thou, O king, art the head of gold." And Nebuchadnezzar was probably thinking, yeah, can I remember that? It's probably an image, a man. And after you, there's going to be another kingdom that arise, which is going to be the chest and arms of silver. Then after that, there's going to be a belly and thighs of brass. Then after that, there's going to be 2 legs of iron. And after that, to make the image complete, there's going to be standing on its feet, which is composed of part iron and part clay. Yeah, so the king would have probably, maybe it all came back to him, and he was sort of refreshed that, yes, good. Now I remember what I dreamed. But what does it all mean? So Daniel laid out the interpretation of the dream as well. And this is where the beauty of the Bible comes in, because everything that he revealed to the king of Babylon has actually been historically verified. It's probably one of the great things that we can anchor a belief on the Bible on. The interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's image is history unfolded in a nutshell. And if there was nothing else, apart from the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, that would convince us, this would be a very, very good start. And so, we know from history that Babylon in 606 BC was predominantly one of the richest countries and nations on the earth, because everything that they had, a lot of the implements that they had were just made of gold. It was readily available, they were prosperous. The cups, the vessels, the drinking goblets, a lot of things were paved with gold. And so we can relate Babylon to the head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar. After Nebuchadnezzar, after his reign, in the reign of his grandson Belshazzar, there was a change of leadership. And the Medes and Persians came in and toppled the Babylonian government overnight. And so the Medes and Persians, under Darius and Cyrus, were the new control power base in the area. 538 BC. And a lot of the things that they used, implements that they had, were predominantly silver, really correlating perfectly to the component of the statue. After the Medes and Persians had their time, Alexander the Great roared through in 303 BC, and he was the Grecian king, and predominantly they used a lot of brass in their weaponry. And so we can see exactly history before its time. God knew what these nations would be using, what would be the predominant metal of the time. And it's interesting as we go through the metals that the value of the metals decreases in value Gold, even today, is the most expensive precious metal. Silver, brass, iron. Don't know how much they'd pay for something made out of part iron and part clay. It's a little bit of a rubbish. It just doesn't stick together. So as the value decreases, the strength of the metals increases, because gold is very malleable and very ductile, and as we get down to iron, added with more carbon, it becomes strong and rigid and fearsome. And so the nations, as one succeeded another, they became more fearsome and more terrible. So that we get down to the legs of iron. There was two of them. The Romans, probably the most fearsome military force upon the earth at that time. So it's interesting that God in his wisdom gave a heathen king a dream about the future, about the world history unfolded. And we can confirm it perfectly by history. And the time periods you can see up there. But one thing that we note, down the bottom, the stone. Now, on that slide that you see before you, the image looks like it's actually standing on a stone. But it's not. Let's go to Daniel chapter 2 and verse 35. Actually, verse 34 for connection. So that's Daniel chapter 2 and verse 34. In the Bible that I'm using here, the page number is 1277. Now, Daniel is a prophet towards the end of the Old Testament. It's probably about an eighth of the way from the end, sort of back towards. So I'm going to read verse 34. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Well, it was probably the best part of the image to strike, don't you think? If anything was going to break an image and topple it, hit it at its most vulnerable part. The feet were made of the most dodgy material, things which don't stick together, iron and clay. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver and the gold were crushed together and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Friends, this is where it gets good. Because when the stone strikes the image must be standing for it to be crushed and fall, and then the stone becomes big. Who is the stone? What's it all about? Remember when we did this? We did this here. The stone represents something. It's a shadow or it's a forecast of something to come. So we're talking about here. Stone is none other than this man here, Jesus. But not Jesus when he first came. Jesus when he comes again to build the kingdom. Verse 45 of Daniel chapter 2, I'd like you to have a look at. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that's all I want to read. The stone was cut out of the mountain without hands. Think about Jesus and think about how he was born. He wasn't normally conceived or conceived by the normal way. He was conceived through the power of the Holy Spirit. And so he was cut out, if you like, of the mountain of humanity without natural intervention. It was divine intervention. It was something special. Jesus is the stone. I've got 4 verses up there. Matthew 21 verses 42 to 44, 4 references. Psalm 118 verses 22 to 23, Ephesians 2 verse 20, and Mark 12 verse 10. They tell us very clearly that Christ is referred to as a stone. We've read Daniel chapter 2 verse 45 in part. Let's just have a look at it again. Let's read verse 44 for connection. In the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms and shall stand forever. So here we have Daniel in a land of sin and death, being given a promise of a time to come when a kingdom will be established. A kingdom will be established which will topple all kingdoms which should be in power. And Daniel was privileged to be able to be given this vision. When will this happen? This will happen when Jesus comes back. Because Jesus is the stone and he will return. He will return to establish the kingdom. That's what Acts chapter 1 verse 11 says. They're the disciples looking up into heaven as Jesus ascended. And they're saying, look, you Galileans, why are you looking up into the heavens? You're looking at Jesus obviously, but he's going to come back again. As you saw him go, he will return. And that's going to feature prominently in this part here in our session number 8 when we talk about Jesus returning and what he will do. But it's a very, very important prophecy, Daniel chapter 2, because it's telling us what kingdoms are going to rule in world history. So, it was during the kingdom of the Medes and Persians that a prophecy was decreed. 70 years was fulfilled. The time had come for the fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy in Jeremiah 31 to be fulfilled. Jeremiah said that after 70 years, my people would return back to my land. And so it took King Cyrus to make a proclamation to say to the Jews living in Babylon, my people, you go back to your land. And King Cyrus was only too happy to release the Jews back to Israel and give them whatever they needed to do the rebuilding process. And so as they came in the deportation mode 70 years before, in 3 groups, Daniel being amongst the first group, and so they returned back to Israel, the land of Israel, in 3 groups. And there's the return. Zerubbabel led the first return, and then came Ezra, and then followed up by Nehemiah. And they all did courageous and excellent work. The main project that they had in mind was that they needed to rebuild the temple and they needed to make the walls of Jerusalem secure. And that was their main job. And you probably know the story about Ezra. He commenced the spiritual reforms, but Nehemiah was the one who came back and really got the people started in doing the building work. And he finished the walls in an incredibly short time, and the rededication was made, and there was great rejoicing. Although when the people came back and they saw the temple rebuilt, those old enough to remember what the temple looked like in its first glory, they wept because it just wasn't as magnificent the second time around. Ezra and Nehemiah, very important people in God's plan, because they basically brought the people again back from veering towards the red line, back towards God, and drifted them down and reminded them of their obligations in committing themselves to seek the blue line. And that's where we leave our little talk about the regathering of the people back into their land And to tell us what will happen afterwards, we invite Dave to give us a little bit of a tour of the time in the land to Christ.
Okay, thanks for that, Steve. So, if you want to turn to page 35 of your books, and there's a paragraph there, and the phrase there is from Malachi to Matthew, and so that's the section we're going to be dealing with next. The period between the last minor prophet, that being Malachi, and to Matthew, obviously the start of the New Testament. So it reads, the Old Testament, and this is just a summation of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is largely the story of the failure of Israel to achieve the heights to which they were called. But it is also the story of a faithful minority, on that blue line, who kept the laws of God against all opposition, and of the mercy of God in providing for these people. It is also a story of hope. Throughout the Old Testament, there is an underlying theme of the kingdom of God, when the Messiah would sit on David's throne on earth. We know that this is to be Jesus. So I really like that paragraph because it sums up the Old Testament really well, doesn't it? So basically, there's nothing in the Bible besides prophecies made about this time. We won't be referring to any verses because there was a period of 400 years of silence. Okay, so there was no prophets. There were no more kings, so there was no overarching king during this period. There were no divine revelations, so no prophecies. Even though prophecies were being fulfilled, there was no actual new prophecies. And there were no more prophets until John the Baptist came on the scene. And no more angelic visits as well. So it really was a time of quietness from God. So the time in history we're dealing with is the time of the Greeks in 303 BC. So Steve has really laid that out well about Alexander the Great, really conquering the metal, that being bronze, and using that in warfare. So Alexander the Great, he attacked the Persians, defeated them in battle of Issus, and by 330 BC, the Persian Empire was under the control of Alexander. The picture there is the extent of his empire. So you saw the picture before of the Babylonian Empire. It was quite small, wasn't it? It was just that area of Iraq, Iran, going into Israel. It came up to Turkey and down to Egypt. But now we're talking about a much greater area. So Alexander, anyone that knows the history, was really well known for the campaigns he took, and he just was at such speed. And the Bible actually prophesied about Alexander and described him as an eagle, as swift as an eagle. And on their banners, they had the representation of the eagle, didn't they? So Alexander died at age 33, and his kingdom was split up amongst his 4 generals. And that was also prophesied in Daniel. So 2 of the main generals controlled the majority of the area. So one was known as the Ptolemaic kingdom and the Seleucid kingdom. So to begin with, the Ptolemies controlled Israel, and this was a time of prosperity for the Jews. Hebrew scriptures was translated into Greek, the Septuagint version, so that also included the Apocrypha. So that was a time where they got 70 Jewish scholars in and translated the Old Testament into the modern vernacular of the day, that being Greek. So like I said, 70 Jewish scholars did this work, and the myth goes that they were all put into separate rooms. They translated the works. When they put it together, it was exactly the same. They knew it was that they were directed by God. That's the myth anyway. So Greek language and culture was spreading, and it was the supreme language of the day. So there was a shift in power. The Seleucids took over control of Israel. The Ptolemies' boundaries changed, and then came on the scene a man named Antiochus Epiphanes. He was a piece of work, this man. He was very proud in his Greek culture, hated Jews with an absolute passion. Entered Jerusalem straight away, 40,000 killed. put them into slavery. Daniel 11, verse 30 to 33. This was all prophesied from Daniel, and this was when it was foretold. He broke the walls down and burnt all the gates and ransacked the temple. He even erected a statue of Zeus in the temple court. And we all know that Jews' culture, pigs are an unclean animal, so to really offend the Jews, he sacrificed a pig on the altar. This fulfilling Daniel 11, verse 31. He sought to convert Jerusalem into a new city called Antiochia. Jews hunted and exterminated, and God's word was even sought out and destroyed. But we know that God, even though there was no direct message from God, God was still in control, wasn't he? He was bringing about these nations to fulfill his will. God had already pre-planned all this. Who was going to come into power? What would they do? And this was still Jews being punished for their sins of their forefathers for going against God. So the Jews are a really proud people. So they weren't going to put up with this for very long, were they? So on the scene came Judas Maccabees. He was a Jew and he refused to submit to this oppression. He had 5 sons, and it started off with small guerrilla warfare. It soon turned into large-scale war, and they recaptured the Temple Mount in 164 BC. So we're getting really close to this line here, only 164 years away. Temple worship recommenced. City was divided into 2 parts. So the Maccabees held one, and the other was held by Ptolemies. City divided into 2 parts until 141 BC, in which case the Maccabees held the east, Seleucids the west. 141, Jonathan and Simon conquered the whole city. Maccabees Palace built, and they added the Strato Tower to Jerusalem. And so this is the original borders of the Maccabees, but then after the battle it extended. This is in 141 BC. It extended out to this area here. So quite a big chunk of land, really, when you think about it. So the peace was short-lived, and it was overcome by Rome. So Rome, as we know from Nebuchadnezzar's image, you had the 2 legs of iron. So fulfilling Deuteronomy 28, verses 48 to 52. Like I said, 2 legs of iron, which represented Constantinople and Rome. So on came the team of Pompey. He lays siege to Jerusalem and conquers the city back from the Maccabees in BC 63. So he had 2 sons, Herod and Phasael, and in BC 37, Herod confirmed as king of the Jews. So Herod did some major building programs in Jerusalem, and he built the temple that is referred to all the way through the New Testament. So this is the Roman control of Palestine, just a map. So these borders are constantly shifting. So it brings us to the situation at Jesus' time. What was the situation? Herod, a non-Jew on the throne. So different to the previous Herod that did all the building work, this is a different Herod. Roman control of the area, Greek language as well as Aramaic spoken by all the people. Many Greek beliefs and customs accepted by the Jews. So, like I said previously, when they wrote the Septuagint, it was the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. What came with it was some of the doctrines or customs that sort of filtered its way through, that found its way into the Apocrypha. And so these things influenced the Jewish customs. So there was a corrupt priesthood bent on political intrigue. So basically the Romans allowed the Jews to maintain their priesthood, but under strict control. And so the priesthood was so afraid of losing that power, because they, for all intents and purposes, were the leaders of the people. They were so afraid of losing that power that, as we read in the New Testament, they really challenged the authority that Jesus was bringing in. So I went through that really quickly because it is just a history. You can pull up your history lessons and read that at any time. And the idea is to really talk about the story of the Bible. Is there any questions from that? So as a summary, Israelites were taken captive, and God said he had enough with the evil kings. I will overturn it, and it shall be no more until whose right it is, until he comes, and I'll give it him. So that was obviously talking about Jesus. Return in successive waves from captivity. They were prophesied to be away for 70 years, and then they started to return under different prophets. Temple, then Jerusalem rebuilt. 400 years of silence, though prophecy still being fulfilled. The land subject under differing hands and kingdoms, and that's it. So that was a bit of a whirlwind tour of 400 years, but I don't think it sort of is much value to spend much more time on that, given that we have a big session coming up with the New Testament. So, was there any questions or comments before we move on to session number 6? Nope, okay, let's move on.